Okay, well, we're at 35, which is seems like a good number to get started. So just to welcome everyone, I'm David Reiner. I am, amongst other things, Deputy Director of the UK CCSRC, looking after systems and policy. I guess they rotate through to give everyone a different bite of the apple, sometimes a storage session, sometimes on capture. And Karis had asked me to put together a session on policy. And as luck would have it, in February, I had COVID and I was a bit slow in getting around to things. And as we all know, by the 24th of February, we had the Russian invasion of Ukraine, and everything changed in the world and of energy. So I used kind of that delay as an advantage, and was able to put together what I think is a great panel of speakers to talk to us about, well, I guess we call it the intersection of energy security and climate policy. And we have, again, three speakers who are able to actually bring, quite different disciplinary and experiences, insights into the thinking about these issues. So first off, we'll have Samantha Gross, who's at the Brookings Institute in Washington, D.C. And so she's up a bit early, so thank you for that, Samantha. She is a director of the aptly named Energy Security and Climate Initiative, which I'm sure when she took the job didn't realize just how topical it would be by the kind of early 2022. Next, we have Dr. Chyong, who's based here at Cambridge, who is been working on, if you want, the intersection of energy security and climate policy for many years, primarily in terms of economic modeling, and also done a fair bit of work on things like Russian gas pipelines. And then finally, we have Dr. Emily Cox from UKirk and Cardiff University, and Emily's a social psychologist who has worked on everything from energy security and what that means at the individual level to greenhouse gas removal. So I've asked each speaker to speak for about 15 minutes or so, and I think a couple of them have slides. I know Samantha doesn't, but I'm very keen to get started and then leave plenty of time for a discussion with the audience. So without further ado, I'll turn the floor over to Samantha.
So I want to use, I think this is probably a good opening for this event today. I want to talk about today's situation mostly, but I want to use it to highlight some of the challenges and opportunities that it brings for energy security. The intersection between energy security and climate change has just become much clearer given the events of the last few weeks, as David said in his introduction. And so I want to just highlight some aspects of that and some ways that you may or may not be thinking about it coming into this event. So the war in Ukraine is likely to change the shape and timing of the energy transition, accelerating it in some ways, raising challenges in others, and particularly in Europe, where the rubber is really meeting the road on this. Here in the United States, where I am, especially from a policy perspective, we kind of forgot that energy security was a thing for a long time. From 2017 to 2020, the US Congress was even selling oil out of our strategic reserves that are kept around for emergencies, just such as this one, for revenue, for our general fund, and also to modernize our strategic reserves. And so this is sort of how far we've gotten from the idea of energy security. Because the US became the world's leading oil and gas producer, politicians sort of forgot that the United States is still connected to the world market, and that increasingly natural gas supplies are also linked as well with geopolitics. They remember now, all of a sudden. They got a very serious reminder. And so I want to talk a little bit about the calculus that went into the invasion and go from there. Clearly, Russian President Putin miscalculated. Maybe he thought that that the war would be easier than it has been. Maybe he thought that the Western world would be fractured or have a muted response. And that hasn't happened. But the West miscalculated too, especially Germany, which is the European country that I know the best, having spent quite a bit of time there. After the end of the Cold War, many in Europe, and particularly in Germany, were focused on integrating Russia into the world economy. This mutually beneficial relationship they believed would bring peace. The idea of trade and integration into the European economy would bring peace. And Russia's pipeline system with Europe is a bit like a marriage, really. It's something that's intended to last a long time and to foster a relationship of interdependency around energy issues. And so the idea was that this could help to create a stable relationship. Germany also has been turning to Russian gas to fill the gap left by the closing of its coal for climate reasons and its nuclear plants. This is true in other countries as well, along with really critical use of gas in home heating, particularly in Northern Europe. So now what? Given the fact that Putin is waging war in Ukraine, given the fact that energy is still flowing, but sanctions are already very severe on Russia, and gas flows could be caught up, energy flows in general could be caught up if Russia decides to weaponize them or if the West decides to deepen sanctions. And so this just isn't looking good from either direction. But everyone understands that oil and gas revenues are funding Putin's war machine, and that continuing to buy oil and gas undermines the sanctions that the West has worked so hard to put on nearly every other kind of Russian transaction. So we're really in a challenge. And here in the United States, nothing angers citizens and voters quite like high gasoline prices. The politics are awful. On the right side here in the United States, you have politicians yelling, "Drill, baby, drill," and blaming high energy prices, particularly gasoline prices, on Biden's climate policies, which have made no difference at all. On the left, they're complaining that we wouldn't be here if we'd already done the energy transition, if we already had a renewables-based economy. We've done this all sooner. And so there's just this political battle where nothing is working well for anybody. But the truth, as it often is a lot more complex than these two sides on either end of the political spectrum yelling at each other. The world has a timing problem between the energy system that we have right now and the need to feed the beast right now, and between our long-term ambition to change our energy system to a net carbon system. So let's first talk about this timing issue. Clearly, the world needs to move to a net zero energy system for all the reasons that we understand, sooner rather than later. But given the trillions of dollars of infrastructure that are in the ground now, and it ranges everywhere from huge power plants and steel mills that run on fossil fuels, all the way down to the gas-fired furnaces in individual homes that are keeping people cold or keeping people warm during the winter. This just can't happen quickly. So in the meantime, right now, we have to focus on feeding the energy system we have. We need fuels and we need electricity to keep people warm and moving and the economy pumping. And some of these near-time actions are far from ideal for the climate, unfortunately. In the United States, we have actually approached regimes that are not necessarily our favorites, not the friendliest to our political interests, to look to get more oil onto the market. I kind of question the wisdom of this move, but the administration even went to Venezuelan dictator Maduro to talk to him about producing more oil. We've also gone to the Saudis and the Emiratis and asked them to tap into some of their spare capacity. And you might question, why? What do these countries have to do with Russia? But oil is globally shipped and it's largely fungible. Prices are high everywhere, and the prices for each kind of crude oil aren't exactly the same, but they're generally right around the same value and differ based on quality. Oil is fungible and it can go where it is needed, and the infrastructure needed to move it is widely available. And oil is the product that has been the traditional focus of energy security, old school energy security. You think about the geopolitical events we faced before, Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, the Arab oil embargo, the Iranian Revolution. These are sort of old school energy security events. And although it certainly raises challenges, as we're seeing now, we have a playbook for this. We know how to do this. In particular, the world keeps stocks of oil in reserves in importing countries. And the United States, even though it produces more, still has its stocks. We hold oil just for these sorts of events. And so we've been here before. It's not great for the economy, but there's a playbook. We kind of understand this. But this crisis is different. And the reason why is because it involves natural gas. And for the European audience that I'm speaking to, this is really where the rubber meets the road. When gas flowed strictly by pipelines, and pipelines were these sort of long-term marriages, basically, between producers and markets, we weren't so worried about gas security. We had that interdependence that we were talking about before. But now we have the Russians politicizing gas, not for the first time, but this is certainly the most severe gas crisis we've seen in Europe. And also gas supply has gone global. It's beginning to look a little more like oil supply through the mechanism of liquefied natural gas, or LNG. Natural gas, liquefied natural gas, is not as easily moved around as oil. Import and export facilities are fewer. But Europe's gas challenge right now has become Asia's gas challenge, as high European prices pull LNG away from Asia due to Europe pulling in cargoes. And even in the US, and I think this is kind of rich myself, but you hear complaints that our natural gas prices are too high because we're exporting just as much as we possibly can. But still, Europe can get some relief, which is good. The LNG era has helped there, but it has also taken Europe's crisis global. But Europe is likely to substitute for some of what that gas does today in electricity generation by bringing back some sources that we don't want. You're likely to see coal plants run longer or more often than was intended in particular. And so in a lot of cases, this may mean short-term coal use and perhaps extending the lives of plants that were intended to retire. But it's at least more doable right now than going in and replacing all those millions of home heaters in people's homes. That's at least something that we can deal with right now to deal with the gas shortage. So, okay, in the short term, this isn't looking great for emissions for the reasons that I've described, particularly because Europe is likely to tap into coal to make up for the lack of gas. And you might see some of that in Asia as well, because gas has become expensive. But here's where we get back into climate policy. Enough about hydrocarbons for a minute. This crisis has really highlighted the need for a transition away from fossil fuels in a big way. There's this renewed understanding that energy security is a driver for the energy transition. This isn't just a climate and environment issue. And I really feel like energy security has been kind of a sleeping giant in the climate debate. We'd kind of forgotten about it in a while, certainly in the United States, I think in other countries as well. But energy security won't be put to bed either when the energy transition happens. We'll have new and different concerns in that new world, especially manufacturing of solar panels and other equipment, and minerals for everything from batteries to magnets in wind turbines. But I'll close by saying that this is still a better world, in my opinion, because we have to remember that all those materials we need in the renewable world aren't fuels. We'll need them in smaller quantities, and we'll need them to build new. We won't need them to continue to run the renewable energy system that we'll have in place. If we should have a shortage of critical minerals somewhere, existing equipment and vehicles, et cetera, will still continue to operate. So we'll have new energy security concerns, but I don't think we'll see lithium or cobalt or rare earths become the new oil. And that's a good thing. And for there, I'll stop, and I look forward to the rest of the discussion and questions.
Thanks, Samantha. That's a perfect way of kicking off, I thought. So without further ado, Chyong, you have the floor.
Yeah, I have a couple of slides, and thank you, Samantha, for sort of giving a very good overview of some of the issues that I wanted just to bring up. So you can see on this chart, this is the projection from the European Commission that was done back in late 2018 when the European Commission launched a long-term energy strategy, and they modeled a number of pathways to reach low carbon energy system in Europe by 2050. And this is the composition of the energy mix in the final consumption. And you can see, you know, the variation in the fuel mix across the number of scenarios and years. You can see, you know, they have modeled a number of scenarios that would get us from 65% of GHG reduction relative to 1990 level to 80, 90, and then the two scenarios for the reaching net zero. I think the basic message here is that as we decarbonize our energy system, obviously we will rely less and less on the fossil fuel. For example, so currently around 60% of the energy consumption is coming from gas and fossil liquids, in particular crude oil and petroleum products. But as we move towards a low carbon energy system, that will go down to around 9 to 10%, depending on the scenarios that we look. And obviously, as we reach a low carbon energy system, the replacement for the fossil fuel will come from low carbon electricity. So roughly 50% of our final energy consumption will come from electricity, and in particular low carbon electricity. So the basic message here is obviously, and it's quite that energy security, as we understand, reliance on the fossil fuel from foreign producers will decrease as we decarbonize our energy system. But as Samantha said, I mean, the increasing reliance on electrification as the main pathway to decarbonize poses other challenges, in particular on the critical materials, wind turbines and solar panels, which I will come back now. So in terms of electricity, electrifying our energy system, so we've done some modeling to remodel the European Commission, so like net zero scenarios. And this chart shows you the expansion of the electricity supply that is needed. So you can see on the chart here, the orange curve shows you the historical electricity generation from 1990 to 2019 at the European level, and then on the gray curve shows you the simple linear trend that is needed to take us from now to a net zero pathway. So basic message here is that electricity supply needs to expand by at least 88% compared to the 2009-18 level. And that is a challenge of, you know, we need to ramp up the electricity system by factors of five times the historic growth rate, or 2 times if we take the expansion from 1990 to 2008. Now, this is just the electricity supply in general. What we really need also is obviously that electricity should come from low carbon energy sources, and in particular wind and solar. So on this chart, I've graphed you the to show you the historic wind generation, as well as the trajectory that is needed to hit net zero, and also plotted a best fit based on the historic projection and the recent wind target announced by European Commission as part of the Fit for 55 recent policy targets. You can see that even with a very recent announcement on sort of like front loading rollout of wind to reduce our reliance on Russian gas, we're still a bit short of the level that is needed by 2030 in order to meet the 2050 target, the net zero target that has been discussed since 2018, at least in terms of the long-term strategy that the European Commission has published. On the other hand, the Fit for 55 solar targets is really ambitious and overly ambitious in terms of if you compare that with the required growth in the solar generation expansion to meet the net zero target. But I think I'll come back to this in the conclusion. On balance, if the two targets are combined, they're more or less at the same sort of level that we may require to reach the net zero. The other pillar of the repower, so like EU plan to move away from Russian gas, is renewable gas, and in particular biomethane. So you can see here we also model the in the net zero modeling exercise that we have done. This chart projects the required biomethane growth to meet the net zero, and also you can see the initial the original plan for biomethane target by 2050 that has been announced recently, but before the events in Ukraine, is that the European Commission wanted to have at least 17 billion cubic meters of biomethane by 2030. But obviously in the repower EU target, that target has been doubled to roughly 35 BCM, which is actually in line with the trajectory to meet 2050 target. So I kind of deliberately discussed the sort of like electrification pillar of the repower EU targets, because in the recent repower EU targets, European Commission stresses three important areas. Obviously, gas supply diversification, which I hope we can discuss at the Q&A session. The electrification that I've just discussed, and in particular the front loading of the wind and solar targets, and as well as biomethane production. And so some of the conclusion obviously is that if net zero target by 2050 is binding, then failing to reach any of these three large and ambitious targets will mean that the other low carbon options needs to scale up, because we know the end goal is to reach net zero by 2050. And that brings me to the final comment, is that reaching 2050 net zero can alleviate our concerns regarding the dependence on the fossil fuel coming in particular from Russia in 2050. But the energy security concerns since the Ukrainian events demands action now more than before. And some of the interesting questions in terms of the technology, R&D, and innovation is when is the tipping point when we're going to see a massive rollout of these low carbon technologies that we need to meet 2050 targets, which is in line with energy security as well. So I'll stop here, and I look forward to the Q&A session.
That's brilliant, Kong. Thank you. That kind of we're kind of moving move from across the Atlantic to more of European view, and now Emily is going to bring it down to I think as the individual. So, Emily, the floor is yours.
Great, thanks ever so much. Yeah, I'll just share my slides quickly. Yeah, so my name's Emily. I'm a social scientist working at the University of Oxford now. I only just started. But before I start, I want to start with a fairly giant caveat, which is that we're in the middle of a very new and very rapidly unfolding situation, right? And therefore, we really need to be very careful about what we know and what we don't know. In part, I think my caveat is because I don't see myself as an expert on gas pipelines. I don't see myself as an expert on Russia, especially. You know, I'm interested in public attitudes, in public acceptability. And I think that at the moment, because the situation is so new, there is a real gap in our understanding about a lot of this stuff. There are a lot of big claims being thrown around, particularly in the media. But I'm going to, you know, maybe go through kind of what we know and what we don't know about this stuff. But first of all, my sincere apologies for being a typical social scientist and starting out by defining something, right? But I don't think we can ask about energy security unless we know what we mean by energy security, right? And so what I'm going to do in the middle of a very rapidly evolving situation is take you back in time ever so slightly and point to all of this work showing that energy security is inherently slippery. And so what it means depends on who you are, it depends on how it's framed, it depends very much on your location, and as both of our previous speakers pointed out, depends on the timescale on which you're talking. And the problem with a slippery definition like this is that it gets what we call securitized. And so the idea of needing to maximize security gets used by actors to push forward agendas that they probably wanted to do beforehand. But this idea of energy security, because nobody can actually define it, is quite useful as a reason to do various things. Right? And as Samantha pointed out, we've got a bit of a historical tendency to focus on especially oil and geopolitics. In part, that's because energy security as an academic discipline owes quite a lot to the OPEC oil crises in the 1970s. Right? So this is some work that we did actually quite a long time ago, where it was an expert elicitation study, and we asked an awful lot of experts what is important to them when they think about energy security. If you really want to maximize energy security, what should you do? I'm not going to go into this graph in detail, right? I just want to point out two things. So firstly, import dependence was ranked very, very low by our experts. It's not that important to them. What people care about is how stable the imports are and how diverse they are. The reason that import dependence, I think, gets used quite a lot is in part because it's very quantifiable and the data is normally publicly available. And that means that it gets used as a proxy in models because it's a lot easier to measure than really complicated things like flexibility and responsiveness and stuff. The second one I want to point out, and I'm sorry for the acronym, so it's LCOE stands for Levelized Cost of Electricity, which was one of several indicators we used as a proxy for how much things cost. And in the UK, where we did this study, the electricity is very, very dependent on gas. And so gas prices are very important in this, right? The reason I flag this up is because there is a massive continuing debate over whether affordability counts as part of energy security, right? Because on the one hand, some people argue, well, no, actually, it actually trades off against energy security. So some things that you do to maximize your energy security actually cause your costs to go up. Therefore, it's a separate thing, it trades off against it. Whereas the opposing argument says, well, if you can't afford your energy supply, you don't have a secure energy supply. Therefore, of course, it's energy security. And on the next slide, we'll see why this is important, right? And also, we just found that there were two kind of emerging worldviews that our experts fell into. So on the one hand was the argument that what matters is stuff that we have a normative imperative, right? Stuff that it's immediate, stuff that is morally right to do, that kind of thing. But on the other side was this argument that energy security, in order to be usable, needs to be quantifiable. It should use simple indicators, and that's where things like import dependence come in. So I want to just briefly mention what I see as two slightly unloved aspects of energy security, right? On the understanding that if we're talking about actual disruptions to supply, the vast majority of them stem from within a domestic system rather than without it. And so the first one is basically how your system is running, how capable your system is. And this is a lot of really simple things, like have you invested properly in your infrastructure? Have you adequately weatherized your infrastructure so that it doesn't all freeze over like what happened in Texas last year, right? With all their gas infrastructure froze, and then there was a massive catastrophic blackout that lasted for a really long time. And so this is what happens when people actually lose their energy supply. This is what tends to be the cause. Everything else tends to impact price first and foremost. And that's why this debate about whether price and affordability is actually a fundamental component of energy security or not is really important. The second thing is public attitudes. And so I've got 3 examples in pictures here from France, Netherlands and the UK of incidents where public opposition fundamentally changed the course of energy policy. In some cases, it caused short-term supply shortages. In some cases, it led more to a kind of long-term change in the way in which the energy system looked, right? And I'll come on to that more on the next slide, but I think this is all really complicated, right? And I think it's easy to end up feeling a bit lost in how we actually deal with all of these trade-offs. So I have an easy answer to you, right? If you really care about minimizing trade-offs between all these different objectives, you need to focus on the demand side. And the irony is that a lot of policies on demand reduction, had they been followed through in the way that they were supposed to be, had they not been dropped, then we would be in a much better situation, both for energy security, but more importantly, for affordability and for people's actual ability to heat their home. So when it comes to public attitudes, my question to myself was, do we know anything about the impact of the current fuel crisis on public perceptions of climate change? And so I think there's often an assumption that more focus on energy security will lead to lower concern for climate change. And this is because, you know, people have a finite pool of worry. People feel like climate change gets bumped off the agenda by an immediate crisis and so forth. And also because they might perceive trade-offs between the net zero agenda and their ability to afford their energy supply, right? I think there's a bit of a lack of empirical work in this space thus far. We know that disruption can actually act to increase people's concern about climate change, and this is work by Alexa Spence and her colleagues. We know that there was a prediction that concern about climate change would drop during the pandemic, but it actually didn't. So this is Derek Evanson's really good survey work. We know that the gas crisis isn't new, so it was already kind of occurring in 2021 as prices were rising exponentially. And so we know that polls at the end of 2021 showed that climate and the environment was still often people's #1 concern, and definitely in the top 3, right? But I do wonder whether what might happen with all of this is we might see more like reluctant acceptance for projects that are perceived to be important for energy security. Now, reluctant acceptance is something we see a lot with nuclear power. It's this kind of idea that, oh, well, I really don't like it, I really don't want it, but if it's what we have to do, then I may be okay. And I wonder whether some projects such as hydraulic fracturing for oil and gas might experience some more of this reluctant acceptance. I spoke to Derek Evanson about this, and he was of the opinion that, at least in most of Europe, fracking is so universally hated that that is not going to happen. But maybe it could happen for some other things like oil and gas in the North Sea. So just finally, I became very aware that this was a carbon capture and storage seminar, and I'm supposed to know about carbon removal, right? So I just give some really final points on that. I think we need to ask some questions about what this means for carbon capture and storage. The economics are not looking particularly favourable. They already weren't great before all of this, right? if we can't do gas carbon capture and storage anymore, what does that mean for hydrogen? Does that mean we can't do blue hydrogen anymore? Because if we can't do blue hydrogen, maybe we're in real trouble. This is the UK's pathway to 2050. I've got some rather terrifying numbers circled there. If we can't do carbon capture and storage, what happens to greenhouse gas removals, which are very, very reliant on that? And I think the gas prices, not necessarily the Ukraine conflict, but the gas prices in particular, raise some really worrying questions about this. And just very finally, so that we don't take our eyes off the prize, I just wanted to highlight 2 quick quotes for you. Firstly, rich countries must end all oil and gas extraction by 2034. That's from a report last week by Kevin Anderson. And secondly, Fatih Birol from the International Energy Agency, saying if governments are serious about the climate crisis, there can be no new investments in oil, gas and coal from this year. And he said that last year in 2021. Anyway, I'm going to wrap up. Thanks ever so much. I look forward to the discussion.
Thanks, Emily. That was brilliant, as usual.